From our digital broadcast center in New England, this is Your World Discovered. My name is David Ewen from E.P.N. My guest today is Michael Phelps, not the Olympic athlete, but the novelist. And we're going to be talking about his books, most importantly, about the well-known actor from years ago by the name of David Janssen. And we'll talk about the author's relationship with the actor and the books that have been written. His website is www.michaelphelpsnovels.com. Again, that's www.michaelphelpsnovels.com. First, let's welcome Michael Phelps to the program.
Good afternoon, David. It's a pleasure, and thank you for having me.
It's good to have you. The first thing we're going to talk about, you've written the book quite a bit of writing about the well-known actor David Janssen, who was formerly on a television program so many years ago called The Fugitive. And before we went on air, we talked about a movie remake. Before we talk about your relationship with the actor and the purpose of your book, let's give the audience an understanding of who David Janssen is.
David Janssen appeared in 44 feature films during his career, and he was the star of 4 television series. He's best known as Dr. Richard Kimball in The Fugitive, which aired on ABC television from 1963 to 1967. When the series ended, David was physically and mentally worn out, and he chose to end the series. They had a 2-part segment called The Judgment. That was the conclusion. And it was watched by 72% of television owners in the United States at the time. Of course, his fame is worldwide.
Now, your relationship with David Janssen, how did that come to be?
I was working at as Hilton Hotel security at the Conrad Hilton Mansion. We were pulled there to provide security for a big gala party that he held, over 400 guests. And David and his first wife, Ellie, were among the guests. And I was standing by the main bar when David sauntered over to get a refill. And this was before the dinner hour. Ellie and David did not stay for the dinner. And he started a conversation with me, and it ended up being about a 40-minute conversation. He had worked a long day that day and was not in the party mood. But he was a very down-to-earth, nice gentleman. When Ellie came over and asked if they were going to stay for another drink, he said, "No, I'm ready when you are." And he introduced me to Ellie, and we exchanged business cards. And I never expected to hear from him again. Here's this mega TV star, and I'm literally a nobody. I was fresh out of the Air Force. And 2 weeks later, he called. He had invited me to have drinks with him at the Formosa Cafe, which is primarily, it was the Hollywood entertainment set would gravitate to that. It wasn't on the tourist map. And we had several drinks there, and that became a routine. He would call me late at night, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and that went on for 15 years of our friendship.
So you developed a very strong relationship, a very good friendship, and in any friendship, there's an allegiance towards each other. And now today we're talking about the material that you've written about him. Tell us about the time period that led from about the time of the ending of, and I assume it's because of his passing, the friendship, and when you said, "Here's a pen, I'm going to start writing about him." How did that all start?
Well, it actually didn't start that way. David passed away, unfortunately. He had a massive heart attack at the age of 48. And 20 years later, his first wife, Ellie, had relocated from Las Vegas to Miami, Florida. And she was touring, being taken around by our membership director, the Jockey Club, which is a world famous private club. And my brother and I were in the cocktail lounge talking about the day's business. And nothing happened that first night, but the next evening, she again came into the cocktail lounge with Bobby, and they sat at a table near ours and were talking. And she kept staring at me, and I was a little bit uneasy. And I said to my brother Bob, I said, God, I know her. And suddenly she said, Mike? And I said, yes. And she said, it's me, Ellie Janssen. And I thought, oh my God. So, of course, I went over to shake her hand, and she practically pulled me into her lap to give me a kiss on the cheek. And Bobby Starr said, you know each other? And Ellie said, well, yes, he was a very good friend of ours. And I thought, I only saw you 3 times after, during that period. What that led to was Ellie and I, and of course Bobby and my brother Bob and his wife Cheryl, having many dinners and lunches at the club. And one evening I asked her, Ellie, why haven't you written a book about David, your marriage to him? She never remarried. She loved him to her dying day. And she said, well, I've thought about it, but I wouldn't know how to do it, and I don't have the resources. So I suggested, well, I'll finance it, and we could get you a ghostwriter. We went through 2 ghostwriters, who, by the way, had non-refundable retainers. And after about a month and a half, I said to Ellie at the end of the second ghostwriter that she just discharged arbitrarily, I said, Ellie, we can do this ourselves. And so we wrote her memoir, David Janssen, My Fugitive. It was very cathartic for her. But years later, in 2000 and I think it was 2011, I started writing David Janssen, Our Conversations, which is a recalling of hundreds of conversations David and I had over the course of the 15 years that we were friends. And a lot had to do with his marriage, divorce, other affairs, people he worked with, actors, writers, directors, producers. And I released those books, and it, in a way, offsets Ellie's book because we had a lot of contradictions. One part that's in the book is we were writing her book, and I'm sitting in an alcove in her bedroom in Las Vegas. We were on our way to Los Angeles. She threw a cup of coffee across the room, shattered on the wall, all over my computer monitor, and all over me. And I had said to her, I said, well, Ellie, that's not what David told me. She threw the coffee, screamed several expletives that I can't repeat. We didn't talk for about an hour and a half. I cleaned up the mess and left her room. About an hour and a half later, she came and apologized. So I decided in my own mind, it's her book. I'll just tell her story. Because things that we discussed in writing her book, David had told me of the same people, same incidents, and I found that I can't contradict Ellie. But I then knew what David went through. So that's why I wrote David Janssen, Our Conversations, which is in 2 volumes.
My guest today is Michael Phelps, and this is his website, as you see at the bottom of your screen, michaelphelpsnovels.com. Again, that's michaelphelpsnovels.com. After working with Ellie, later on, one of the titles of the books that you are talking about is David Janssen, Our Conversations. And that was the second iteration of publication of an understanding of the actor and the persona of who David Janssen was. What was it that said, I can write? that I'm a writer and I can publish? How did that come about?
Well, at the time I worked with Ellie, I was working as the chief investigator for a prominent Miami law firm engaged in specializing in criminal defense. And with the success of Ellie's book and the retirement of my boss, I decided to take early retirement. And I said, well, I'll just write. But I promised myself I would never author a book again, especially with the ex-wife of a celebrity. And I decided that I would write about a genre that I know, and that is true crimes and courtroom dramas. So I wrote my first book, which is The Execution of Justice. Actually, you did a radio interview with me back in 2009 on this book, which, believe it or not, this is the true story of the murder of a dear friend and one-time mentor of mine, who is a detective sergeant in the robbery and homicide unit of the Indianapolis Police Department. He was killed in the line of duty. The two trigger men in this gang that murdered him were actually executed. And the first one was executed 14 years after Jack's killing. And he became the last man in Indiana to be executed in the electric chair. 2 years after his electrocution, the second killer was executed by lethal injection. So I felt, even though Jack Orberg was his name, was against the death penalty, he was smiling down because he got justice.
Now, you're talking about some of the writing that you've done, for example, true crimes and courtroom drama. Let's talk a little bit about that. Then we'll go back to the book about David Janssen. But a lot of people are not familiar with courtroom activities because they don't work in the field and they haven't really been in a case. My case, for me personally, I went to jury duty, was there for 3 days, and the judge threw the case out of court. So that was the only activity. That was the most drama. See, there's my air quotes for drama. What do you bring to the table, if you will, to the person such as myself and many others like me who are not familiar with that? What can they learn from this style of writing that you have?
Well, there's a lot of intricate detail, both as a police officer and as a prosecutor, as well as a defense attorney. From a defense attorney's point of view, you are concerned with finding and planting in the mind of a jury reasonable doubt. Now, if you're charged with murder, you don't have to prove you didn't do it. The prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you did it. So my current book that's out now, The Jockey's Justice, is based on an 8-year-old case where a jockey was murdered. 8 years later, his wife, who became our client, and son-in-law were charged with the crime. I worked on that case for 2 years. It was a very interesting case. And when you're doing it from an investigation point of view, you must be concerned with every minute detail. And what a neighbor may have seen and think it's not important could be a key.
You know, one of the things that I talk about, I'm just writing some notes just as a reminder of myself, is that there's 3 elements in a case, and I wanted to ask you about this. And I talk about it when I've, for 11 years at the university, I was teaching copyright law as one of the 18 different subjects I covered. And one of the things I said in a court of law, the judge is looking for 3 things, to hear 3 things. One is witness, evidence, and the other one's date and timestamp. And when I say witness, I'm talking about who saw it, evidence, what do you have to show me, and the date and timestamp is when did things happen? What's the sequence of events? And when you take those three ingredients and put it together, you can pretty much come to the truth. Because when it comes to plaintiff and defendant, the truth is somewhere in the middle, and that's what the judge is doing, using those ingredients. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts in that area?
Well, I agree with you, and that applies both in civil cases as well as criminal cases. However, in a civil case, you do not have to prove, neither side, plaintiff or defendant, has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to prove it's possible from both sides and let the jury weigh the evidence that's presented and then come to a verdict. So it's basically the same, but criminal law, when you're going to take a person's freedom, you better be certain that it's beyond any reasonable doubt.
And we have seen in the news, and it happens extremely rarely, but with the point that you're making, I can imagine some of our audience members are thinking of, well, what about the guy that was released from prison
30 years
or something like that? And that's, I'm thinking of one particular example, but there's more than one. There's quite a few. What I want to do now is bring us back to, now that we have a better understanding of what you are as a writer. Let's talk a little bit more about what type of intricate details, recollection that was necessary to accurately write and give proper tribute to the well-known actor David Janssen, who back in the 1960s had the very well-known television show called The Fugitive. And incidentally, for those that may not be familiar, a lot of people are, I'll say, as I mentioned before we went on air, my parents loved the show, and that's how come I'm very much familiar with it. But we were talking about a remake, a Hollywood remake, Harrison Ford, Tommy Lee Jones, I believe, and they did the remake. So it was it had a long-lasting effect on television. So how did you provide the intricate detail to give the proper tribute to your very dear friend, David Janssen?
Well, I can tell you, first of all, that David appeared prior to being cast by Quinn Martin, producer of The Fugitive. He appeared in his own television show called Richard Diamond, Private Detective, from 1957 to 1960. And there he was cast by the very famous actor, producer, director, Dick Powell. And that was his start to his rise to stardom. Once he was cast as the Fugitive, that was it. His star skyrocketed, and he became an international star. One thing about David, he had the public persona for his fans, and he did everything on screen to perfection to please his fans. Off screen, he was very down to earth, very ordinary, and he wanted an ordinary life, but celebrity wouldn't allow that. He had very bad choices in women. That caused him a lot of problems. When I started writing the books, after Ellie's book, I closed my eyes and I thought back to every conversation we had. I want to emphasize there's no way they're verbatim. But when you have a friend like David Janssen of that stature, and you're a nobody, you value that friendship, but you never forget. And I started writing, and I could hear his voice. And I recalled writing Ellie's book with her, and it was like him being there. And I didn't hold anything back. He did curse a lot, but not in public. Some of the words I did leave out, but I tried to portray David to his fans the way he really was. and that was an ordinary guy who just happened to have a job that put him in the little screen to millions and millions of people internationally.
Now, your writing of David Janssen, which is it's a detective series, the television show called The Fugitive, and also the series before that that you had mentioned. And you've also written other books in the area of true crime and courtroom drama, and so we've talked a lot about that. So to write about David Janssen, about his career, is not too much different than the other writing you've done outside of the discussion of David Janssen. So it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that the relationship with David Janssen and the type of work he did perhaps made it a little bit easier because it kind of fit your style of writing. Does that make any sense?
Right. David happened to have high regard for police officers and law enforcement. He was adamantly against drugs. Now, in Richard Diamond, he played an ex-cop private detective. In The Fugitive, he was the wrongly convicted Dr. Richard Kimball, accused and convicted of killing his wife. His series after that was with Jack Webb called O'Hara, U.S. Treasury, where he played a Treasury agent. He did not like that show. It lasted, I think, one season. And then a very gifted Hollywood writer named Howard Rodham wrote a series called Harry O, for Harry Orwell. This was David's last television series. And he wrote it specifically for David Janssen. And in this series, David is again a wounded, retired, medically retired police officer who is a private detective, lives on the beach in Malibu, and would take cases, and you never see him get paid much. His car was always broken down. He'd ride the transit buses. But it allowed him to show his comedic side. And David was a very funny guy. He had a quick sense of humor, quick wit, and would joke around with his friends, crew members, fellow actors, ordinary people. And he loved doing it. But that series was canceled after 2 seasons by Fred Silverman, who became the new president of ABC Television. And even though David Janssen and Harry O, the ratings were sky high, Silverman wanted nothing to do with any series that he was not directly connected to. So he took Farrah Fawcett and I believe Jacqueline, I can't remember the other girl, who were Charlie's Angels. That replaced Harry O.
Wow, wow. Let's get information to our audience about your website. Let's take a quick look. Again, this is Michael Phelps, who I am speaking with today, and he is a novelist. He has written about his dear friend, David Janssen, who was on the television show The Fugitive, a detective TV show. And he's also written other books in true crime courtroom drama. We'll talk a little bit about that. His website is www.mikephelpsnovels.com. mikephelpsnovels.com. And with me is Michael Phelps. We're talking about some of his writing styles. What do you think makes a good writer for the genre that you're in, that we've been talking about today?
Well, in writing detective novels or courtroom dramas, you have to be believable. In order to be believable, you have to have had the experience or witnessed the experience that your characters are going through. If you can portray that to the average reader who is interested in that genre, then they start to become part of the story. They feel like they're following the protagonist or the good guy or the bad guy, and they are rooting for them. But you have to keep their interest.
How do you make the depiction of crime in courtroom drama real? And I asked that question in a way that, what is it you're doing to your audience, and what is the audience saying? How do you appeal to the audience?
Well, I would like to think that when they are reading the novels, then they feel a presence and they feel like they're part of the story. They're an observer. And if you can weave your words along the storyline, the plot, to bring them from point A, well, this is interesting, to the conclusion, the climax, and make it exciting. And yet, until they get to that last page, they haven't yet figured it out. But then when they read the last paragraph, for example, it all comes together.
Share with us, if you could, as a reminder, some of the more recent titles of books that people can find on your website and also on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Okay, well, we have David Janssen, My Fugitive, which is Ellie's memoir. I released in the 4th edition, updated. It's currently still selling, and this is her book, which is a very good photo of David. The next book I wrote, which I mentioned you had talked about in 2009, this is The Execution of Justice, which is based on the murder of a police officer, a friend of mine and mentor. And then Jockey's Justice, this is available in the ebook form now and is coming out in paperback soon. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, all the internet booksellers. It's based on a murder case that I alluded to of a horse racing jockey, and my boss, our defense firm, represented the defendants. And it was a 2-year investigation between their arrest and the trial. And well, quite an interesting case, because it took me and my associate into the underbelly of the sleazy side of horse racing, the sport of kings. And we discovered another jockey's murder that had still been unsolved. And it was interesting. You see the corruption, not only among the horse racing stewards, as well as the local town leaders, for example, that had a lot of money involved.
My guest today has been Michael Phelps. His website is michaelphelpsnovels.com. We've been talking today about some of his books and also his relationship with the well-known television actor from the 1960s, the television show primarily that most people know David Janssen as, The Fugitive. Michael Phelps writes about detectives, activity, true crimes, and courtroom drama. Michael, thank you for joining me on Your World Discovered.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
This is Your World Discovered. My name is David Ewen, and this is E.P.N.